we're going to do for our chocolate and raspberry cake is to soak our gelatine. So we've got gelatine leaves here. Just going to break them up so they're separated, and then pop them into some really cold water. Ideally you want ice water, but if you haven't got any ice water, then make sure you put it in the fridge for at least sort of half an hour. Otherwise your gelatine will soak, but then it's also going to melt into the water and you're going to lose some of the setting power. So we're going to put a little bit of gelatine in the water and leave that to soften up. And in the pan I've got my raspberries. And then once the gelatine's melted in, we're just going to add our fresh raspberries and just break them down a little bit. We want a little bit of texture, so obviously you want to have some pieces of raspberry in there. We want a nice bit of compote in the middle, not just whole raspberries. So I'm going to pop these into our moulds. Broken down fouilletine and also some dried cranberries. I'm going to pour that over the chocolate and use the heat of the cocoa butter to melt the chocolate. Run it through with a spoon, so pop that in there. Just mix it together, just bind it together. Silicone paper here, and I'm just going to take them onto the table, put a little spoonful of mix. Yeah, so use my rolling pin just to roll them out thin. It doesn't need much pressure, you literally just need to roll the rolling pin over the top, really, really lightly, just to flatten it out, and then you'll come up with this. And then what we're going to do is use our cutter just to make imprints into the mix. So next thing we're going to do, next thing we're going to make for our chocolate and raspberry cake is the chocolate mousse. So I've got my cream, my trimoline. If you don't have trimoline, you can use just normal sugar in a pan, along with my milk as well. I've got my egg yolks here, my chocolate, and also some gelatine. So the first thing I'm going to do is pop the cream mixture on the stove. So now that's come up to the boil, we're just going to pour it over the egg yolks. Just before we do though, don't forget to get your gelatine soaking. Just so that's ready when you need it. Nice cold water. And then we're going to pour our cream and milk mixture over our eggs. Just going to pour it in. Make sure that you whisk as you go in as well. Otherwise what will happen is you're going to end up with scrambled eggs. And then we're going to put that back on the stove for about a minute or so, just until the mixture gets up to 82 degrees. And you'll see that it's 82 because it will start to thicken slightly, but I would still always use a thermometer just to make sure that you are bang on temperature. So we're just going to pop that back on the stove for about a minute on a low heat. Okay, so as soon as that hits 82 degrees, we're going to pour that whole mix over our chocolate once we added our gelatine. So into that mix goes our gelatine. Just make sure that's completely dissolved. And then we're going to pour that whole mix on top of our chocolate. And then whisk it together. So you can whisk it and bring it together. Really nice smooth mix. And And we're going to take either a bowl or a nice sort of flat tray is always best. And what we need to do is put this into a tray, cover it with a cling film, and then leave it to cool down before we fold in our whipped cream. Otherwise it will melt the fat in the cream and the mousse won't set properly and it won't be light at all. It'll be really dense and horrible. So just gonna mix that, make sure everything's in properly. And then what we're gonna do is just pop that into our tray. And the perfect temperature for this is going to be 31 or 30 degrees. And again, I would use a thermometer just to make sure. So we're going to put some cling film over the top, and we're going to let it cool down until it gets to about 30-31 degrees at room temperature. So please don't put it in the fridge, because if you put it in the fridge, it will end up setting around the outside and then the middle will still be hot. So just a little bit of cling film, room temperature, and then just keep an eye on it as it cools down. It's not super whipped up, it's not thick, it's just sort of still rolling off the whisk. It needs to have a little bit of form, so you'll see it drizzle back into the cream and you'll still see the drizzles on top of the cream, but you don't want it to be solid. If it's holding its shape, it's way too thick and you're going to end up splitting your mousse. So, yep, so I'm going to take the cling film off and then we're going to put in a little bit of the cream to the base, just to loosen it slightly. And we're going to use a whisk to loosen it up. Pour that back into the cream and fold it through. So you've got a lovely smooth mousse. Just very lightly will fall off the spatula like that. And then that's perfect for piping into moulds. If it's too thick, what will happen when you add your inserts into the cake, it will cause air bubbles. We're just going to pour a little bit into our bag. And take the end of my bag. You don't want the hole to be too small, because if you try and force mousse through a very small hole, it will kind of aerate the cream and it will split the mousse. So you want quite a big hole there, and then just put enough mousse in there to come nearly to the top, not all the way, just nearly towards the top there. Right, so we've got the inserts out of the freezer. All you need to do is just pop them out. So you've got nice domes there. They've been in the freezer for about an hour, 2 hours. And then you're just going to push those into the centres of your mousses. Don't go all the way to the bottom, otherwise it's going to break the mousse. You want it to be suspended right in the centre. So, just going to push these in. Almost just to cover it. Just a touch. So I've got a little palette knife here. What you're going to do is just smooth over the tops. Just make sure there's no gaps, because if you have gaps there, what will happen is when we glaze them, the raspberry will defrost and it will start to seep out. You want it to be suspended inside the mousse. Okay, so I've taken the bases out of the freezer, just taken off the excess, and then been left with my little discs. So I'm just going to pop them into the top there. And all that will do is just allow us to have a base that we can get our palette knife underneath, and then we can move it around when the mousse defrosts and gets soft. So I'm just going to pop them on top. And then once the bases are all on top, I'm going to pop those in the freezer and ideally leave it to freeze overnight. Okay, so now we're going to make the glaze for our raspberry cake. So in this bowl I've got everything but my gelatine and my liquids. And all I'm going to do is mix together, so it's cocoa powder in there, the sugar and all the dry stuff. And then I'm just going to add the water and the cream and make a paste. And then while I'm mixing that, I'm just going to soak my gelatine. So we're going to make a nice smooth paste with this, and then we're going to transfer it to a pan, and then we're going to boil it. But be really careful with this because it will burn quite easily. So you want to use a Mousse to keep moving it around while it's slowly coming to the boil. So that's the paste now. I'm just going to pop that into the pan. And then just going to put that on the stove and bring it up to the boil. Okay, so that's just boiled, it's come off of the heat. Just going to take off the heat and then just put in the gelatine. And then all we'll do is just mix that to dissolve it. Lovely, so once that's dissolved, we're going to just let it sit for a minute. And what you'll find is a lot of bubbles and impurities come to the top. And all we're going to do is just skim that off with a ladle. And then when that's done, we're going to let it chill down to about 25 degrees before we glaze our cakes. So all you need to do now is just take a ladle and just skim the surface of your glaze. Okay, so now we've skimmed our glaze. All we're going to do is put it into either a wide bowl or a tray just to cool down. So I'm going to just pour it into the bowl there. And it's really important you cover this with cling film, otherwise it's going to skin. So that's all done there. And we're just going to take the cling film and just place it over the top. And make sure that it's touching the actual glaze. If you do it just over the top of the bowl, then as the glaze cools down, the water will fall back into the glaze and make streaks in it. So you want it to be touching the top of the glaze, and then we're just going to leave that to cool down and then prepare our cakes. Okay, so now I've taken the glaze out of we've taken it out of the fridge. You can leave it at room temperature, but you can also put it in the fridge to sort of speed it up. It's about 25 degrees now. So all I'm going to do is pass it through a sieve just to make sure there's no lumps. You will pass it into a jug because it's ready to pour then, so you want to use a jug to pour over your mousses. And go straight into the jug. And then I'm just going to grab the mousses from the freezer and we're going to demold them and then glaze them. Okay, so I've got my mousses out. They're completely hard, completely set through. So to demold these, all you need to do is just push with the palm of your hand and they'll pop out one side, and then you just pull with the other hand. And you should get a nice round shape there from the mould. And I'm going to put them onto a rack. If you don't have an oven, like a baking cooling rack, you can just use an oven rack over a tray. I tend to just do a few at a time and then just keep the rest in the freezer just so they stay solid. Okay, cool, so I've got my glaze here, and all I'm going to do is just pour it over the top. It's a nice temperature now, it's not too hot, about 25 degrees, and we're just going to pour it across the top. Make sure that you get everything in there, there's no spots left. You should get a nice shiny glaze. Okay, so there's loads of different ways you can finish this, but today we're just going to use a little bit of metallic powder. You just dip our brush in, we're just going to give it a little bit of a shine on top. So dip your brush in, make sure you knock off the excess, and a little knife here to lift them onto a plate. And I put the knife underneath, pull the palette knife out, and then that just gives me room to, instead of dragging the glaze. And that's our chocolate and raspberry cakes.